In modern society, freedom and liberty are often used interchangeably without any understanding of the difference between the two concepts. However, there are distinct yet subtle differences between the two philosophical ideas of what constitutes freedom and what is liberty. Understanding the differences between these two ideas is essential when it comes to understanding Western civilization. Therefore, it is important to be able to explain these differences and how these ideas were shaped over thousands of years. Freedom, quite simply, is the freedom in one's self, meaning that a free person can control their passions, they have self-control, they have awareness of their condition, and they seek to control it. Others cannot control a person if that person is in control of themselves. Ultimately, one strives to have independence from the will of others, and this is true freedom. Aristotle defines freedom as the capacity to direct oneself to those ends which one's reason rightly recognizes as choice-worthy, or also known as rational self-direction. Aristotle also notes that freedom rests with the ability for one to operate and understand reason. This idea of reason is needed for the rational, reasoned individual. They need to have the capacity to apprehend suitable ends, and they choose appropriate means to those ends. The reasoned person therefore can plan and control their current and future state. They have no other obligations or controls that prevent them from being free in both body and mind. Aristotle also notes that a truly free person is one who exists in his own sake and not for another. Now, the concept of what constitutes freedom is still debated upon. There are two key ideas that make up what many consider being in the state of freedom. First is negative freedom. Negative freedom is what modern society tends to lean towards. Negative freedom, according to Isaiah Berlin, is to be free to the degree which no man or group of men interferes with my activity. Further, Berlin sees freedom as the ability to actualize one's desires without external hindrance. Negative freedom basically gives the right for a person to live how they want without anyone controlling them. Yet, this also lacks the idea that one should control their passions. A person who lives solely upon the idea of negative freedom can find themselves completely controlled by drug addiction, alcohol addiction, or the lust of the heart. While free to engage in these acts, the person might also find themselves soon enslaved by their passions. Positive freedom, or more so as the Greeks saw it, self-mastery, seeks to ensure that the free man has control over themselves, which in turn frees a person from the slavery of uncontrolled passion. Socrates asks, "Then do you think the man is free who is ruled by bodily desires and is unable to do what is best because of them?" The Greeks found freedom in virtue and self-mastery, but the Greeks also contend that virtue and self-mastery, as opposed to negative freedom, was critical in establishing and creating a government that was moral and would not interfere with one's freedom. Plato understood that without moral foundations, notes Alexander Rosenthal-Publo, that freedom of all desires, appetites, and moreover, overturns social order and leads to a condition of lawless anarchy that eventually culminates in tyranny. Lastly, Aristotle notes that there really needs to be two defining aspects to ensure a man truly has the ability to be free. The first one has been covered, and that is living as one wishes, free from external and internal constraints. The second is that Aristotle notes, the multitude must necessarily have authority. What is resolved by the majority must be final and must be justice, and each citizen must have an equal share. Or that all citizens must have access to the ability and a right and share in ruling. That all citizens must be equal and their voices should be equal to that of another. A person that holds power in the state is still answerable to the people. and the same laws will judge them. Everyone is, as Pericles noted, equal before the law. The idea of what constitutes freedom may seem easy at first, but there are many layers that one must consider when defining it. And one should ask, what style of freedom do they seek? Freedom from passion and the ability to maintain self-control in a value-based position? Or seek that of free will to do as one pleases without constraint, yet may fall victims to vice? America's founders sought to create a government that would allow for freedom, but they understood that it must be grounded upon virtue, and that a society without control would soon develop into tyranny. George Washington stated that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government, and Benjamin Franklin notes that only virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become more corrupt and vicious, they have more need of masters. And John Adams clearly pronounces that it is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. The only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue. Therefore, when it comes to the idea of American freedom, men must have self-control and virtue, control their passions, and ensure equal representation and application of law when it comes to governance. While freedom is best understood as being within the self, liberty is freedom from government-imposed restrictions or the need of a government, or it is also the need of a government to ensure that one's liberties are not interfered upon by another. Cham Wysberski studies what Romans considered freedom, comes to the conclusions that Roman defined liberty to be capable of possessing rights of one's own, and that is possible if one is not subjected to someone else's dominion, or the possession of rights and the absence of subjugation. Liberty is reliant upon the protection of one's natural rights, and there must be an apparatus in place to protect and uphold those natural rights, and that apparatus is the state. According to Cesario, the state exists to uphold laws which are in harmony with the universal principles of nature. If a state does not uphold right reason in agreement with nature, it is not a state. Furthermore, Cesario asserts that the highest function of the state was to safeguard people's life and liberty. Government, or more often referred to as the state, is needed to protect liberty. For one to enjoy liberty, it is not sufficient to be free from coercion or the threat of it. It is necessary to be free from the possibility of it. This makes it clear that one does not simply seek to gain liberty from government coercion, but also coercion by a private individual that might seek to control or restrict your liberty. Thus, there is need for limited government action to protect your liberty. Government is needed to protect your right to ownership of private and personal property from the attempts of others to steal or obtain your possessions by force. This also goes for the redistribution of your personal property by the government in the name of equality. Cesario contends that private men are never deprived of the goods by public acts, and nothing could be worse than government attempting to create an equalization of goods. Freedom and liberty are sought in order to allow for a person to maximize their ability to be free, or freedom of the individual. In order to be a free individual, one must free themselves of passion and establish virtues and self-control. For one to achieve and have liberty, they must use that virtue to help govern and rule fairly, and to ensure that the state protects the freedom and liberties of others, not to inhibit or control it. These ideas have been established and debated for over 2,000 years, and while there are slightly differing takes, each establishes that according to nature, that man is entitled to freedom and liberty.